How to Train a Happy Mind is a production of the nonprofit Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment. Our podcasts and programs are free and ad-free, thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you've benefited from the interviews and meditations we share, please consider supporting the podcast with a tax-deductible donation at howtotrainahappymind.org. And if you'd like to meet weekly with me and other like-minded seekers of the authentic causes of happiness in our chaotic world, you'll also find links there to join our Train a Happy Mind community or get a copy of the How to Train a Happy Mind book and audiobook that features a foreword by the Dalai Lama. I'm Scott Snibbe, and this is How to Train a Happy Mind. Rob Hopkins is one of the people doing the most to assure that humanity has a healthy, thriving, and yes, happy future. I was blown away by his new book, How to Fall in Love with the Future, which describes a radical new type of climate activism he's invented, where instead of bemoaning the current state of the world, he invites us to imagine the world we want to live in that's just around the corner, and then do everything we can to make it a reality. Join me now to find out how to fall in love with the future. Rob Hopkins, I am so thrilled to have you back on How to Train a Happy Mind. You were a beloved guest in the past, talking about the Transition Network and all the wonderful things you've done to help local communities gradually scale to help save the world, for lack of a better phrase. And now you're back. You sent me an advanced copy of your book, How to Fall in Love with the Future.
Good.
And I fell in love with the book. So welcome, Rob.
Thanks.
Now, just hearing that, probably people may be scratching their heads. You described the future as something we can fall in love with. Why do you think love is the most powerful motivator for action today and not fear or urgency, which are probably the more dominant methods being employed?
If Martin Luther King had said, "I have a nightmare," history would have recorded that speech very differently. I feel like we're living in a time here in the middle of 2025 when we're recording this, where for many, many people, it feels like the future is being cancelled. The future is being colonized. The future is disappearing for people. There's that line in 1984, George Orwell's 1984, that if you want to imagine the future, picture a human boot stamping on a human face forever, or whatever that horrible quote is, And I feel like now it's basically, we've just replaced that with Elon Musk doing Nazi salutes. And it's really dangerous because it means we kind of stop thinking and dreaming and planning and seeing the future as being something that we can in any way, shape, have any kind of involvement in. And as anyone who listened to the first episode will know, my work is very much underpinned by trying to find creative responses to the climate and ecological emergency. And I feel like, again, we're living in a time where what the far right are doing in the US, but also all around the world, increasingly, terrifyingly, is that they point to the future and they say, "Oh, the future looks terrifying, but we are strong and powerful and we will protect you from that." And if what's happening at the same time is the people who are the more progressive people, the people who understand climate science, the people whose politics and worldview is actually rooted in compassion and care and goodness, I suppose, to some degree, if they also are just painting terrifying visions of the future, people have nowhere to run to. People are kind of trapped like rabbits between two different sets of headlights. And so for me, I feel like what I'm trying to say is that for a while, that narrative that we saw in the climate movement that was about collapse and extinction was really important, because we need to understand that's where we're headed. But that's a terrible motivator. And so really one of the questions that underpins the new book is, what if we saw the purpose of our activism as being to help people cultivate longing for the future, for a different future, a future that, it's maybe on the outer edges of possibility, but it's still possible. It's there, and we could still do that. And so that's why I talk about falling in love with the future, because longing is such an intense, powerful human emotion. But longing is somehow more than really strong desire. Longing is like a sort of a soul ache, like it's your first love. It's a deep, deep yearning. And I feel like that's what we need to be trying to cultivate in terms of when we're talking about what a low carbon future would be like. How do we bring that alive for people? And one of the recognitions that comes with that is those of us who are climate activists, the people who are climate scientists, we're not very good at that. And so we can't help people fall in love with the future without bringing in artists and poets and storytellers and people who work in advertising and people in our culture who are the people who are good at helping people fall in love with things.
When I read your distinction between desire and longing, it brought up something that people ask me a lot as someone who leads Buddhist meditations, because when you say, oh, desire is a delusion, people say, what? Really? Aren't there nice desires, like desiring for, a healthy planet? And in the Buddhist worldview, they very precisely articulate the mental factors. And they say, no, desire is like this uncomfortable feeling like you can't be happy unless you get something, which you can feel as an activist, like it's part of like that despair. But there's another mental factor called aspiration, which is that longing, like that's the healthy form of wanting something.
Yeah, I mean, didn't the Buddha just say that desire was like honey smeared on the edge of a razor blade, which is always an image that really stayed with me.
Yeah.
Part of the power of longing for me, one of the stories that I tell in the book is about the kind of human project to get to the moon. That actually Jules Verne wrote a book in 1865 called From the Earth to the Moon, where he pulled together all the best evidence and research and engineering you could find at the time about how you might actually do that, and then wrote a really exciting, thrilling story about how we went to the moon. And that book became so popular that it inspired loads of scientists and engineers to start figuring out how might we actually do this? How could this work? And then that inspired other storytellers and musicians and filmmakers. The first feature film, 1902, was called A Trip to the Moon. You had this whole genre of popular science, people writing these magazines about, well, what will we eat on the moon? How will we play football on the moon? All this sort of stuff. The storytelling goes first. It creates the longing to get there. We don't have 100 years when we're talking about climate and change and the ecological crisis. But the same principle applies, I think. We need to be we need to become so much better at giving people things to run towards rather than just things to run screaming in the opposite direction from.
The famous quote by John F. Kennedy, right? Like, we choose to go to the moon and do these other things, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. In that Boston accent. I quote that all the time. My daughter knows it by heart. But we don't have politicians saying those things much anymore, do we?
No, we don't.
I was very struck reading your book how what you do as an activist has changed, in many ways since the last time we spoke. That now you show up as a time traveler from the future and tell this story of coming back from a world that's working. What does this metaphor unlock for you that other forms of activism don't, of being a time traveler?
I turned 57 this year. I've been involved in activism in some shape or form since I was about 14, probably. And I kind of feel like right now we're losing this at quite an epic scale. And I don't know what will work. But I know that it needs to look different from all the things that we've been doing up until now, because they haven't worked. They aren't working. They work a bit. Some things work a bit. But I feel like since the Paris Agreement in 2015, we have seen a massive pushback from oil and gas companies, from the meat industry, from plastics, all these from agrochemical companies. And we're slipping and slipping and slipping and slipping. But actually, for me, this idea of time travel came about in about 2021. I saw a T-shirt a young woman was wearing at a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington, and it said, "I've been to the future, we won." And it gave me goosebumps. Maybe it might be giving some of your listeners goosebumps right now. And it made me think, that's brilliant. what if that was how we communicated and talked about the change that we need to make? I read recently my friend Sarah Corbett, who does what she calls craftivism. She said we need to move from furious to curious, which I thought was really, really lovely, you know. And so about 3 weeks after I saw this T-shirt and it had just set my mind racing, well, what would that actually look like? I've been to the future we want. Like, how would you actually communicate that? What would activism look like if it grew out of that? And I was invited up to London by Extinction Rebellion to speak at a big event they were organising called The Big One. 100,000 people surrounding Parliament calling for more action on climate. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna try something different for this. So I went and bought like this sort of white bodysuit thing from a shop. I bought this sort of space helmet thing. And I went along and I just gave this talk where I said, I've just parked my time machine around the corner and because I've just come back from 2030 and I've just rushed around here to tell you, oh my God, it's amazing. And we saw this and we saw that. And, oh, the bicycle rush hours of 2030 were amazing, and the regenerative farming and the this and the that, you know. It was quite theatrical. You know, I kind of imagined I was like Phineas Fogg, just come back from some amazing adventure talking about this. And there was a moment about 2/3 of the way in where I said something like, having been there and having seen how it turned out, just standing here in front of you all and telling you about it makes me feel really emotional. And I looked round at the faces of the people around me. There was lots of people all sort of stood around, like very close in, like sort of like in the 1950s sort of political speeches, you know. And there were tears on people's faces. And I thought, this is really interesting. What's going on here? And so that's really was the inquiry that started me on writing the book. What's going on in people's minds? And that's why now I have this sort of character of being the time traveler and build this whole narrative that, you know, here in Totnes, we built this time machine and it works like this, and we bring back artifacts from the future. We bring back photos from the future. We bring back different things. We take people there. We're developing a comic book which tells the story about how we built the time machine to travel to collect recordings in the future. We've made a music project called Field Recordings from the Future based on the idea that I go to record places in 2025 that already sound like the future needs to sound like, and then work with this ambient electronic music artist who then makes these beautiful pieces of music. And we've developed this live music and video performance which takes people in to experience that future. And last night, for the first time, I've been working with this young engineer who's just built us a predict your future machine where you press the button and prints you out futures from 2030. One of the people I talk about in the book quite a lot is Sun Ra, the jazz musician. And he always told this story that he wasn't actually a human being at all. He was actually an angel from Saturn. And I read an article about him that described him as being, that he did what he did with an unshakable certainty and a deadpan humor. And that's kind of the quality that I try and do this stuff with.
What you do is like, it's like a kind of climate improv, right? One of the things you learn in improv comedy is you're never allowed to say no. You have to say yes and, yes and, yes and. That comes early in your book too. You say time traveler training forbids sayings like, that's never going to work. But I think a lot of people are grumbling hearing that right now. Can you explain why pessimism is forbidden and what's the role of criticism analysis in making a better future?
So the book starts with a report back on a recent trip that we took to 2030. So it's like it gives people an experience of walking down the streets and across the rooftops of 2030. So we always say that we wear the time travel suits that we wear not to protect us, but to protect people in the future. They have a kind of anti-cynicism coating on them. That means that if we happen to bring any residual despondency and despair with us from 2025 into that 2030, it's not going to impact what's happening. And we use this term where we say, you know, one of the things we're forbidden from doing is any past splaining. Because in this 2030, There is this sense of excitement and exhilaration that people can see the world around them changing really quickly, and they're really excited about it. And it's a really thrilling thing. And so if we rock up from 2025 and say, well, that's never going to work, it's not actually really very helpful. It's like, even in the present, we wouldn't really want that when we're trying to change things. So this work and the ideas that are pulled together in how to fall in love with the future is not something what I'm saying this has to replace all other forms of activism. This is now the way everybody has to do everything. Absolutely not. And there is also, of course, a huge and very important role for work around grief. So grief tending work, all of this, the work of Joanna Macy, all of these sorts of things still are very, very important. What I'm doing is I'm not saying the future will turn out like this. What I'm doing is saying, but it could. It could. And if we shut down the possibility that it could, then we're done for.
I'm also recognizing that this anti-despair coding is also for you, right? That you do feel that despair and you're finding ways to antidote it in yourself.
I always say in my talks, if you're not regularly terrified about climate and ecological crisis, you're not paying attention. This is not an approach that somehow emerges from some sort of happy clappy sort of hopium, sort of somehow skirting around the crisis. For me, when I was writing this book, one of the most important bits of it comes quite early on when I interview Peter Kalmus, who is a climate scientist, who is one of the most important people working in climate science, because he's somebody who is not prepared any longer to sit in a kind of academic ivory tower writing papers. He needs to be out in the world doing something about it. He's been arrested once for chaining himself to the front of the Chase Bank, who was still outrageously funding oil and gas projects, and also for blockading a private jet airport. And so I had a long conversation with him where I said, as a climate scientist, you are presenting these reports which show like all the sort of the different trends and, where we're headed if we don't do anything. And that's what your work is focused on, is that line there. But what's the line that we don't hear so much about, which is the line of, well, what would it look like if we did everything we possibly could have done? Draw that line for me. What does that line look like? Because we never talk about that line. And he said, well, that's what I call going into emergency mode. And that means phasing out fossil fuels very quickly, phasing out industrial meat production very quickly. If we did that, we could still stay below 2 degrees. And then we could start at scale doing all the natural things that draw down the carbon, the seaweed forests, the soils, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, that's fantastic, but emergency mode is a rubbish name for it. Like, no one's going to go, ooh, let's go into emergency mode. That actually we need to be calling it like, delicious possibility mode or something like that. We've left this so late and procrastinated so late that if we'd started 20 years ago, it would have been quite a gentle curve we'd have had to navigate. Now it's like almost a perpendicular drop that we need to make. But we have to make it, because if we don't make it, we're toast. And so for me, it's like, how do we tell the stories about that it feels like we're moving towards something, that it feels like something that we're excited to take part in? And that's only done if we can conjure the magic of longing in the way that we talk about that.
I mean, this is your bread and butter of your life, and you fill the book with some of these stories of vivid sensory examples of actual transformation right now, like depaving streets, rooftop gardens. I was particularly struck by the story of the German city of Vauban. Could you just tell briefly how the people of the city took charge of a better future? Because a couple of stories like this in your book really made me feel more palpably that this is possible.
This is in Freiburg in Germany. It's a district. It's called Vauban. And it was an old French military barracks, I think. And then when the French army decommissioned that and moved out, then there was a public consultation process about what should happen there. And the public got very, very involved with it and said, we want this to be like a really radically low carbon, sustainable neighborhood. And one of the elements of that was they wanted it to be as car free as possible. And what often happens with those things is that, you start out with that, and then over time it gets worn down and worn down. And we'll have some cars, and we'll just have less, The Vauban is like 3,000 people live in this neighborhood, And in the whole heart of this thing, there's no cars. If you live on a street, you can, if you have a car, you can bring it in to drop stuff off, but there's nowhere for you to leave it on the street. There's like a shared community car parking, multi-story thing just on the edge with solar panels all over the roof. But there's no parking within the main development. And so I went there for this project I'm doing where we're making recordings of the future, thinking, well, I know what it'll sound like. It'll sound like children playing and bicycles going past. I spent like 3 days there making field recordings. And after a while, I started to notice there were things that I could hear because the background growl of the internal combustion engine had gone away. I could hear things like people having piano lessons in their houses, which I could never remember having heard that before, hearing knives and forks on people's plates inside their houses. So you began to be able to hear human life in more granular sort of detail. It's amazing. There's a couple of places in the book which is like when you arrived there, you literally feel like you've stepped into the future. It looks similar to things you know, and it takes you a little while to figure out what is it that's different. So one is Vauban, and the other one is the cycling infrastructure in Utrecht in Holland. In the Netherlands, the Dutch government spends €500 million every year building really great cycling infrastructure because they recognize that saves them €19 billion a year off the national health bill. So it's an investment in health and in well-being. And when we go somewhere like Utrecht or Amsterdam and we see the amazing cycling, we think, oh, it must have always been like this, But actually, up until the early 70s, the Netherlands was as much a kind of car culture as anywhere else. They loved that whole model. And then they had 1 year where 3,000 people were killed on the roads in Holland. 400 of them were children. And one of them was a child of a journalist who wrote an article called Stop the Child Murder in one of the main newspapers there. And this phrase, Stop the Child Murder, then was picked up and became a national movement all across the country. And groups of children would just go out and close streets and play in them and go out at night and paint cycle lanes. And it became like a really big movement. By the 80s, a lot of the people who had started that had got into politics and pushed a lot of that stuff through. So in both of those places, when you arrive in Utrecht, in the city centre of Utrecht, there's a particular area there which is just trams and bicycles. And 40,000 bicycles cycle through the centre of Utrecht every morning. And if you get there at 8 o'clock in the morning and you sit in this particular place and you watch it, it's just like, it kind of blows my mind every time I go there. And last time I was there, I met the woman who was the head of transport planning for the municipality there. And she said, yeah, all those problems we used to have 10 years ago with cars, we now have with bicycles because we have so many bicycles. I was like, a lot of cities would give their right arm to have that particular problem.
Yeah, and these are very wealthy, technologically advanced, not particularly socialist countries where this is working. So it could work everywhere. So you reference storytelling, art, even street fashion as tools of your time-traveling revolution. And you say that maybe even the artists of the world are those who are best ready to tell the positive stories of our future. Can you talk a little more about the role of creative people in helping to solve the climate crisis?
If we ask that question, what would our activism look like if its primary objective was the cultivation of longing? Then we have to recognize that climate scientists are rubbish at cultivating longing. That's not what they're trained for. Climate activists are generally not very good at cultivating longing. They're very good at identifying the problem and focusing on the problem and mobilizing around the problem. Not so good at really bringing alive where we might go as a result. The people in our culture who are good at doing that are street artists, musicians, writers, poets, the creative people. We can't do this without those people. The book is kind of a plea to people in the creative world to bring their skills to this. This is when we need them in this time where we have this remaining tiny window of possibility to pull away from the abyss. Why would you make art or culture or music about anything else, really? But also, we have so many of those people who dedicate their expertise to producing dystopian stuff. We are awash with dystopias right now, whether human beings are wiped out by zombies or viruses or aliens or gremlins or whatever on earth it is. We don't need any more dystopian stories. We don't really need utopian stories because they're always so far away as to be not really very helpful. I think what we need is what my friend Manda Scott writes about and calls throughtopian stories, which are the stories about how we got through from now. How did the shift on the scale that we need start now, and how did it build? There was a film that was made a few years ago called 2040 by an Australian guy where he tried to show what would 2040 look like if we had done everything we could have done, and used lots of CGI and lots of different things like that. And he called that film an exercise in evidence-based dreaming, which I love that. I think that's just so beautiful. And so that's really what I try and do in the work that I do.
You know, there was a tiny scene, and I remember it vividly because it stuck out in the New Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson. There's a tiny scene in one of the episodes where they say, oh, you know, we could have a future where half the planet's green and we live in good relation. And they had a beautiful visual of it too. They had a 3D graphic. And I do remember my heart just swelling like, wow, I never see this. Like, we need to see more images like that in popular shows. You know, as a Buddhist, I know you have a Buddhist background also. I couldn't help but see a relationship to Vajrayana Buddhism, because in Vajrayana Buddhism, you're imagining the very best possible future for yourself as an enlightened being. You know, you try to actually picture, oh, what would it be like if I was the very best version of what any human being can be? Has that crossed your mind at all in terms of your activism?
I remember when I was researching the last book, From What Is to What If, I interviewed Mathieu Ricard, the French monk and incredible teacher. And I was that was kind of where I was trying to take him, was, you know, actually, it's kind of like Vajrayana Buddhism. You know, we're trying to get society to imagine the best world that it could create, and then to imagine its own role in that world, and then to meditate on that in whatever way that takes, and to become that, you know. It was a very interesting conversation somehow, because he's very like analytical, very scholarly. He kicked against the word imagination, because for him, imagination represented like a kind of an unruly mind. Like the imagination is like, we could, and we could, and we could. It's like daydreamy, and it's a bit like wild elephant mind, you know, the monkey mind or whatever, you know. And but I felt like he kind of missed the point. The thing that I did love that he said was, I asked him, what did he feel was the impact that social media was having on people's ability to do that? And as our attention spans get worse, how does that impact our ability to think about the world and build it anew? And I loved that. He said, I think if the Buddha had Twitter, he never would have left the palace. You know, if Van Gogh had TikTok, he never would have painted the sunflowers. He just would have taken a picture of them and stuck it online, you know. But also, there was one thing I wanted to come back to when you were talking before about films that have those kind of moments in. One of the things that I think that I've started to notice a lot is how we do the opposite of that. I don't know if you watched The Handmaid's Tale or read The Handmaid's Tale. One of the things that she does, and they do it very, very powerfully in the TV series, is that they take places in the US that people know really, really well, famous landmarks, and then set scenes in this hideous dystopia in those places. So there's a scene that happens by the Lincoln Memorial, which has been changed in this new world to reflect that. You know, so we're very good at using places that we know to create horrible dystopias, like the White House being blown up by aliens in Independence Day. But we don't very often do the same thing where we take places that people know and we present them in a better way. And that's something that I'd love to see us doing a lot more of, because I think that can work really, really beautifully.
One of your stories from the future is that wealth began to seem deeply unattractive. What changes culturally to shift those values? Unfortunately, that does seem one of the harmful trends right now, is disgusting, overblown wealth, you know, not necessarily serving humanity. Do you see signs of that happening? How does wealth become deeply unattractive, and are there signs of that?
I think there are some signs of that in terms of a lot of young people's politics around taxing the rich. I feel like what we're seeing at the moment, particularly in the US, I guess, with this sort of worshipping of billionaires, and that all we have to do is create the perfect conditions for billionaires and somehow everything else will be all right, is creating such revolting outcomes and such abhorrent things that I think we will see a massive sort of move away from that, and it will kind of trigger a sort of cultural shift. I think, we're just on the cusp of it. I think, we've just seen Jeff Bezos getting married in Venice, $35 million on a wedding, which involved basically taking over somebody else's city on their behalf. And because, and here in the UK, until recently, we had, when Rishi Sunak was the prime minister, one of the worst prime ministers we've ever had, whose wife was richer than the Queen. And so you had somebody in the highest office in the land, in a country in which 1 in 4 single mothers is going hungry because they can't afford to feed their children. And you had a prime minister whose wife could have eradicated food poverty in the country and put it on her credit card, basically. So it wouldn't have made any difference to her. And it just didn't happen. And in the Victorian times, you had this culture. Of course, there were many things that were awful about it, but there was this culture among lots of wealthy people where they saw their prestige among each other as being the things that they had endowed: the libraries, the art galleries, the schools, the universities, the public buildings, the public luxury that they made possible. We don't have that. There is no Elon Musk hospital. There's no Elon Musk art gallery. There's no Elon Musk schools. So I think, I think we could well be on the cusp of seeing a real shift in culture around that.
Looking back to that era too, it brings back the point of the power of artists because, in many ways, Charles Dickens created the welfare state. The power of his books influenced the wealthy who are reading them to care about the plight of poor people in society. The story that hit me the most in your book that I was unfamiliar with is that of the surrealist Robert Desnos, who literally saved a truckload of concentration camp inmates from death by imagining a different future for them. I'd just like you to tell that story for people. It's extraordinary.
So Robert Desnos was a surrealist poet living in France. He was arrested. He was part of the French resistance. He was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to a succession of different refugee camps. And the story goes that he was in this camp, and the guards came around and loaded all the men in the barracks that he was in into the back of a truck, and he knew they were all being taken off to be killed somewhere. So they were all driven off, and then as they arrived and they opened the back of the truck, Robert was the first person off, and he stood by the gate and read people's palms as they came past. And he would say things like, "Oh, I see you have a very long lifeline, and I can see you're going to have many, many children and live a very happy, long, long life, And that after a while, the guards, just something changed in the space and they couldn't do it, and they put everybody back on the truck and took them back again. And there's something about, even in those darkest of spaces, the imagination is really important. That sense of possibility is really important. And the other story that I have in there is about when I did a talk in a place in France, and it was a few weeks after there had been a talk there by a woman who was one of the last surviving members of the French resistance, who was 95, and who was in the French resistance as a teenager. And someone asked her, all the people you knew when you were in the French resistance, was there anything they had in common? She thought about it for a while, and she said, they were all optimists. And I feel like when you need optimists, you really, really need them. And we really need them now. And so I guess what I see a lot of my work is about kind of building optimist generating machines. Like how do we produce optimists who are out in the world? And I think, Robert Desnos is a lovely story about how you can do that even in the darkest of times that we find ourselves in.
I am an optimist, but it's not a kind of Pollyanna attitude. I always try to explain to people, a pessimist is wrong because they're so sure, right? They're like, oh no, it's definitely going, that's it. The world's over. That's it. The oceans are going to rise. 3 feet. We're going to burn up all our cities. Of course, the future's not here yet. Now, it might be an 80% possibility. Like you could get to probabilities and say, oh, okay, we only have a 20% chance. But still, then,
Great. We have a 20% chance. Let's do that then.
Kim Stanley Robinson, he knows almost more than anybody on the planet about this problem. And, I asked him that question too. How do you manage to stay optimist? He says, I'm a functional optimist. He says, because I want to make a difference. Like I recognize that the probabilities may be more in favor of disaster than salvation, but I'm going to do everything I possibly can to make that smaller probability of coming out of this.
And there are so many examples through human history of things that changed very, very fast. And we forget that we don't often hear those stories. We just hear everything's very slow, very incremental.
I remember reading this one when I was really young that gave me the kind of optimism you talk about, which is that the level of horse poop on New York streets was exponentially increasing. Literally before the automobile, engineers made the projections. They're like, we're going to be 3 feet deep in horse poop in 3 years. They said, there's no way. This is an unsolvable problem. And then, life changed. The automobile came along, which is then introduced another problem. I wanted you to talk about the what if exercise you do in some of your workshops. I found that really powerful, and maybe it's a nice way to end this too, is more of the practical things.
Yeah, I feel like those two words, what if, are two of the most important words that we have in our language. A good what if question is like, for me, it's like that bit in Alice in Wonderland where she's too big to get into the garden, but she can see through the door into the garden, and she really, really wants to be in there. It gives us a window onto a possibility in a way that feels doable and that feels something really, really exciting. And so when I do workshops and we do work around what if, one of the things that we do is that we do what's called a walk of what if. So we have an overarching what if question. What if in everything that it did, this organization acted like this was really a climate and ecological emergency? What would it do? What would it do differently? And then they go out for a walk and they have all these strips of paper that say what if at the end. And then they just brainstorm. And I say, there are two rules. Don't be constrained by what already exists. And also that no one's allowed to say yes, but. During the whole activity, you can say yes and you can add to their idea and you can build off their idea and you can let it go somewhere else, but you're not allowed to say yes but, because yes but is just the sort of death of the imagination, really. And then so when they come back with those, then we explore those questions and then work some of them up into very firm proposals. And a good what if question is like, there's, I guess, one of the examples I always use is Liège in Belgium, which I talk about in the book, where they're building this food belt around the city of Liège. Most amazing visionary project. But that started with 5 people who said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? And then that inquiry, that question evoked so much curiosity in people and a sense of, yeah, I'd love to see that. And actually, I've got something I can contribute to that. And then so they did a big public event just based around this what if question. 600 people came to this event. And then that then launched a whole load of different projects, which meant that 4 years after that, they had raised 5 million euros to fund 30 different new cooperatives in the city. And that money came from the people of Liège investing into those 30 different co-ops, not the bank, not the municipality, the people of Liège doing that. So a good what if question can unlock so much possibility. It gives us a different way of looking at problems. So when I do workshops and trainings, we do a lot of work with what if, and it's really good fun.
You have any final thoughts for a specific tactic or habit from your practice for a listener to take into their daily lives to be a force for positive change?
Well, I guess before we do that, when I do workshops and talks, we always do an activity where I bring my time machine and I turn the room into a time machine and we take a step forward into the future and we take a walk around using all of our senses. What does this world smell like? This world that you long for, that you would most like to see? What does it taste like? What does it sound like, And once they've done that and I've brought them back again and they've shared with each other what they saw there, what they experienced. I always make the observation that this should be a daily practice, like meditation, like yoga, like running, because the reality is that doing the opposite of this is a daily practice. We do it every day. We wake up, we reach for our phones, and our phones say, everyone's awful, the world's horrible, stay in bed, why would you bother? And that's really paralyzing. So I feel like that it's something that should become like a daily practice, because when we're trying to imagine the future, what we're doing is our imagination is going to the cupboards of our memory and looking through and finding useful things and then assembling them together in new ways. And that's what the imagination bit is. So if we just watch Fox News all day, it's really hard to imagine a low carbon future, because we go to those cupboards and there's nothing there. There's nothing that we can assemble a hopeful longing for the future with. So I always say to people, one of the most important things you can do, one of the most important ways you can feed your imagination, and it's one of the things I try and do in the book, is to know the stories of what's possible. There's a chapter in the book about how we need to stop using the word impossible and replace it with the words not yet. Because all the things that we get told are impossible are actually, a lot of them are the things that we know are entirely possible. Of course we could tax billionaires. Of course we could act meaningfully on climate change. Of course we could have a different energy system, a different transport system. Of course we could, because we can already see it happening somewhere. It already works somewhere, we can see it. But all the things that we're told are possible, like infinite economic growth on a finite planet, are the things that we know just are absolutely impossible. So for me, it's that thing of, find those stories, find the films that share those stories, find the websites that share those stories, find the social media feeds, if you do that will tell you those stories. Because if all we allow in is the stories about everything that's breaking down, everything that's falling apart, the future just disappears and disappears and disappears. So we kind of owe it to ourselves, I think, to intentionally and mindfully fill the cupboards of our memory with stories of possibilities.
That's beautiful. So that's an invitation for everybody to take into their own lives. That addition of yet, young people are learning this lesson. In my daughter's school, whenever somebody says, even like, I don't know how to play the ukulele, or I can't solve simultaneous equations, they always say, add yet.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Sometimes people like to paint it as though a low carbon future is as if we're trying to ask someone to imagine like a Star Trek plot, or, something really, really tricky. I always say to people, it's not that hard. It's the cycling infrastructure of Rotterdam. It's the super blocks of Barcelona. It's the car-free neighborhoods of Freiburg. It's with the food system of Liège, with the commitment to taking space away from cars that we're seeing in Paris, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everything that we need to do already exists somewhere.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's extraordinary speaking with you. In the next episode, we're going to have you tell one of your future stories. So I'm looking forward to that. Listeners can find that in the next episode. Thank you for everything you're doing for the planet.
Well, and thank you, Scott, for everything you're doing for the planet, and bringing the way that you're bringing together the Dharma and the crises that we're in today, and actually finding the places where those things meet. And that is such precious and important work. So thank you for doing that as well.
Thanks for joining me for this interview with Rob Hopkins on how to fall in love with the future. If you'd like to deepen your meditation practice and connect with the community exploring the ideas we share in this podcast, visit howtotrainahappymind.org. You can sign up there for our newsletter and join our Train a Happy Mind community, which offers weekly lectures, meditations, classes, and discussions. You'll also find links there to purchase my book, How to Train a Happy Mind, a modern, non-religious approach to Buddhist wisdom with a foreword by the Dalai Lama. It's available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. If this podcast has been a benefit to you, please consider supporting our nonprofit mission. How to Train a Happy Mind is a project of a skeptic's path to enlightenment. We rely entirely on the generosity of our donors to keep producing our podcast and programs that are always free and ad-free. To contribute, visit howtotrainahappymind.org. We accept cash, credit, Bitcoin, and other cryptocurrencies, and donations are tax-deductible in the U.S. Thanks to Isabella Acebal for marketing and production on this episode. We wish you a wonderful day.